Welcome back to the show.
Today we'll talk about the ins and outs and protocols of hosting official-type people in your own office in China for meetings.
This is more of your area for sure, Brendan.
This is true, Yingying, but there's plenty for you to talk about too, since later on you'll be offering some additional thoughts on face, picking up from our earlier conversations.
Spelling face. There's a lot to say today, so let's get into it. We will start today with Brendan's overview of how to prepare for a meeting here when you are the host. It is fairly extensive, right?
Yep. First, a little background. There was a lot of governmental overlap with several of my previous Chinese projects, and I'd say most of my experience with those types of entities is on their turf.
We covered that a lot on yesterday's show, so if anyone missed it, check out episode 37.
And I've also hosted Chinese clients in the US as part of Western companies or groups, but most of my hosting experience here in China is as the only foreigner in my previous Chinese company, and it's that background that has proved to be the most instructive to me.
You were telling me that the preparations actually begin long in advance sometimes.
They can. Of course, some meetings come up fairly last moment, and things move fast. But generally speaking, when you're dealing with government officials and agencies, they have pretty packed schedules, so you're going to have some lead time to get ready.
And there are differences depending on whether or not the people are in your city or if they're traveling to you. If they are local, then a surprise or rush meeting is a possibility. But for reasons of face, generally speaking, Chinese people want you to look your best in front of them and vice versa. So they will give you as much warning as possible.
So to get into the specifics, there are a whole series of prep steps that I've encountered dozens of times. The setting of the meeting usually happens most often between the number 2 people involved on both sides, although the intention to have the meeting in the first place usually starts leader to leader. And once the meeting has been set, the preparations begin in earnest. There are multiple things happening all at once, so I'll tick through them in roughly a chronological sequence here, but in actuality, many things are happening in parallel.
Let's talk about the physical preparation first.
Sure. The most important physical task is to make sure that the office is in tip-top shape. People are usually called in to do a power cleaning. Furniture gets moved, floors get mopped, paintings get re-leveled, and a general tidying up happens throughout all the areas that guests might possibly see during their visit.
The regular cleaning staff often gets extra help, and junior staffers themselves might be expected to lend a hand. And everyone has responsibility for their own work area. What is next?
The next considerations are the most important ones, of course, prepping for the content of the meeting itself. Conversations are had amongst all concerned parties internally to thoroughly game plan the meeting in advance. PowerPoints are written, demoed, revised, worked, and reworked again endlessly, and everyone involved is drilled on their role in the presentation.
It's kind of like rehearsing for stage production.
It basically is. I've been a bit fascinated by the degree of over-preparation here, but the goal is to not let there be any seam showing during a meeting. Even if the people are very friendly amongst each other, there's a high importance on getting all the expected protocol stuff absolutely correct. And as we'll talk about again later, there's such a high focus on giving, maintaining, and not breaking face for your guests that no effort is spared to ensure that outcome.
Okay, now let's get to the day of the meeting itself. The welcoming of the guest often begins before they even get to your office, right?
Yeah. Now, it's not like this for everyone in every scenario, but if it's government officials who are traveling to see you, it's been my experience multiple times that equivalent level people to the guests actually go out of their way to meet them. They go to the airport or the train station in person, pick them up, and escort them back to the office. So if it's a chairman and CEO of a state-owned enterprise traveling to meet you, then your chairman and CEO are probably greeting them upon arrival in your city. And of course, there are other people involved, other executives, plus junior-level staff who are going to help grab the bags or things. And everyone talks amongst each other, but the rapport-building hierarchical protocols are always in effect, even when things seem really casual.
What happens if your guests arrive around at mealtime?
Again, there are going to be plenty of exceptions to this rule, and I've encountered those too. But most typically, if this happens, then you take the guest to, say, lunch, which has been all set up and prearranged ahead of time by your number 2 person, and you eat before the meeting. Remember that meal times are very sacred here, and although there's a very elaborate but unspoken ritual of how things run during the lunch in this case, you don't have the meeting before the meeting itself. You do some friendly rapport building, and you may touch on some of the things that are going to be discussed later at a thematic level, but you wait to get back to your office to launch into the meeting and presentation proper.
Okay, so now we are at the office. How does it usually run?
Well, much like a meeting in their offices, if you're an executive yourself, your staff has prepared water and tea for every place setting. They've also provided something to take notes with, like individual pads of paper and pens. Everyone at the office who the guests might possibly encounter arrives well dressed that day, and they've been rehearsed as to how they should and should not interact specifically. And the meeting room itself has one final element in many cases, one that you would never see in the West these days: ashtrays on the table.
What? People still smoke in official meetings here?
I know, crazy, right? Not only do people smoke, but if the meeting goes well, there's going to be somebody on each side offering high-quality cigarettes to everybody else. There is still as much bonding that happens over smoking as there is drinking these days, and smoking is somehow more appropriate than draining pitchers of Baijiu at the office. Usually.
What if you don't smoke? You can just pass, yes?
Absolutely, you sure can. And truthfully, I don't smoke cigarettes myself, but I have taken one and puffed on it to be social, more than once. Now, the downside of this is that if people see you smoke, then every time from then on, they're going to offer one to you. Not accepting it later could cause them to lose face, so you have to be careful at the beginning of these relationships to establish them properly.
That leads us to the other part of our show, a few more points about face that we didn't cover on Monday's show. I thought it was important to take a few minutes and focus on decoding 面子 face in a deeper way.
And in typical How China Works style, we will attempt to do so with humor.
Yes, we'll try. There's a joke I heard once upon a time to illustrate these cultural differences. A group of friends from different countries went to a cafe and found there was a fly in their coffee.
Gross!
Yeah, but it's just a joke.
Good.
The important part is the difference in how they all reacted. The first friend was British, and the way he dealt with it was to discreetly remove the fly with a spoon. He hid it under the coffee cup so as not to cause a scene and left.
That sounds about right.
The second friend was Japanese. The Japanese man jumped off from the table, shouted for the manager, and threatened to teach them how to run their business.
Okay, probably a little bit racist, but let's keep on trucking here.
So the third friend was an American.
I'm listening.
And his reaction was also very different. The American casually leaned back in his seat, raised his finger to call the waitress, and smiled at her. He spoke to her in a friendly tone of voice and said, "Miss, can I have another cup, please? One without this little fella right here?"
Oh, I'm glad my guy came off well in this scenario, but that's pretty generous of you.
Hey, I didn't write that joke.
Fair enough. So what happened if there was a Chinese friend?
Wow, his reaction would probably be closer to the Japanese guy. Most likely, he would scream to the waitress, "Get your boss here, 叫你们领导来," and then yell at him.
服务员!
You don't hear that as much as you used to, do you?
Not so much, no, but I have, obviously.
Well, these stereotypes are just to illustrate different possible reactions to the same situation. The reality, though, is that different people have different ways of dealing with the same thing. And in one way or another, they're all related to that culture's view of face, whether they use that concept consciously or not.
This is true at a high level. I guess the takeaways are that the British tend to have more of a discreet style. The Japanese are very strict and do not accept substandard service. The American tries to diffuse a potentially difficult situation with a little humor, etc.
And yes, for Chinese, culturally, they always have to follow or listen to their leadership. When something goes wrong, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, to find the boss or leader or responsible person in a given situation and deal with them directly. And this is all related to face.
Right. We've talked extensively on the series so far about the reality that successfully managing interpersonal relationships relies heavily on the art of giving and receiving face. And to switch back to my meeting example, besides and in addition to all the preparation to receive guests, which of course shows them respect, there is often an elaborate face management system of sorts in place to help ensure that everyone comes off their best, yeah?
You could say that. To help a hierarchically imbalanced meeting environment run more smoothly, the Chinese invented a technique which is called Jianghu. This means to agree on something peacefully or harmoniously. The key to this is that there must be at least one peacekeeper, or the 和事佬 in Chinese. Therefore, he must be the one who has a lot of face, and can manage the face of others as needed.
What are the requirements for this peacekeeper role?
First, that person must have a lot of face themselves, of course. And second, he must have the ability to make both sides have face. But what needs to be noted here is he is not the same as a referee in a sports competition. The referee can decide who wins or loses a game. But the peacekeeper in a Chinese meeting is trying to maintain balance and make sure neither side loses.
I understand it's also important that this peacekeeper person has such a high degree of faith themselves that they are not challenged in their role. Usually the peacekeeper is a very senior member of the meeting, but occasionally they're actually the biggest boss in the room themselves.
Yes. This can happen if there is some sort of a conflict that ultimately the leader needs to decide. If there are conflicting ideas about how to proceed and it falls to the bigger leader or the boss to maintain harmony, they can sometimes do this without actually saying anything. Sometimes only time is going to solve an issue. If it cannot be fixed in the moment, it's best to not stir up a bunch of anger and difficult feelings, but rather to let things calm down in the hope that the right solution will emerge after a period of reflection.
The next thing to note here is that face is like a passport in Chinese interactions, and the face created in a given context only works in that certain relationship. This is something that can be hard for us foreigners to understand, because there is so much unspoken communication happening among our Chinese colleagues. Someone may have a lot of respect to us precisely because they're our friend or colleague who's helping us, but their level of face with other Chinese people determines the reality of how effective they can be.
Exactly. Whether or not someone's face is sufficient to meet a specific objective is something that gets reviewed in context. This is another reason why relationships take so long to properly develop here. People need to spend enough time with you and see you in enough situations that they can feel confident in their understanding of you. No one wants to find themselves losing face because of their association with someone they misjudged.
This face game gets even more complicated. Of course, every meeting doesn't go well, and if someone has their face degraded, then the one doing the degrading needs to be brought down a notch as well. Ideally, everyone is continually having their face raised, but it's important to note that the opposite thing happens too.
To try and ensure the best outcome when there's a difference of opinion, Chinese will make sure to say something like, "Well, what you just said is really reasonable," or "Those are really great points." Then they offer their point of view starting with, "but." This is often quite confusing to foreigners who don't understand what's happening right in front of their face.
I see what you did there. And I know, I've been here long enough and have had conversations like this that I'm able to understand it. If a Chinese person was going to come right out and start their reply with, "I disagree," then the other party will feel like they're losing a lot of face, and it's going to be impossible to continue a productive dialogue.
This gets to our final point, namely, what really is face? At its most simple, think of it as a mask or 面具. It's something that people wear to represent not only who they are inside, but also their position in life and in the given context of the moment.
The mask originated in earlier, more tribal societies. In many traditions, masks are an essential tool for the high priest or a shaman to deal with the gods. With it, they can talk to the gods or even invite God to join them in conversation. They are not just themselves in that moment, they now represent something greater, such as the whole of the people, something more worthy of a god's conversation. Even today, the right mask is very powerful in the right context, which is why people seek to protect them so carefully.
We think of those who have great face and are popular as having a magical power or 神通广大 because the face is originally a mask, a tool for talking with spirits. It gives a magical power when wearing a mask to talk to the gods.
And in our present society, people who are of the status to wear the right mask to talk to a god or a high official are not ordinary people, but people with great status, which is why treating them with respect, whether in their office or yours, is so very important. To me, any episode where we can relate Chinese traditions with Western esotericism is like having Christmas on my birthday. And since we are actually recording this episode on Christmas, Merry Christmas again! Yay!
圣诞节快乐! Yes, podcasting is the best gift I've given myself this year. So I'm happy to spend time to do it right.
We're in the home stretch of Season 1, and we have a few more things to say about official meetings before we finish it up. But before our holiday break, we'll leave you with several things to consider or enjoy in our brief absence, and we'll welcome you back after the new year.
Thanks again for listening. I'm Yingying Li.
And I'm Brendan Davis. See you tomorrow on How China Works.